says is right, is that Jordan and Egypt are heavily reliant on US support, so their ability, they don't have a lot of leverage here, but I suspect that this is a case where the Arab street would not allow their own governments to do this as well. So it's such a complex situation that to just come up with very, what sound like perhaps plausible solutions just offhand, there's just so many layers and difficulties below that it's hard to see this sort of getting off the ground, but we'll just have to watch.
As you've said, the Arab nations have roundly rejected this idea of relocation of Palestinians. And I also do wonder, it's surprising to me in a sense, because how much support or appetite is there domestically in the US to have this level of involvement?
Well, it just contradicts the entire notion sort of what President Trump's been saying, is that he wants to sort of focus the US on the US and just do what works for America and what makes it wealthier and strong.
Foreign aid agreements.
Exactly.
And such,
I mean,
right?
Yes, the termination of foreign aid, or at least suspension of foreign aid for the moment. I mean, the amount of money we're talking about here to remove all this rubble and this is a long way from the US and bring companies in or whatever, and it's billions and billions of dollars. So, yeah, it is a contradiction. By the same token, the idea that you could bring some form of solution to that is going to be tempting to any statesman. We have to remember that President Trump is in what would be his second term, so he's also looking for some sort of legacy, dramatic legacy potentially here as well. And if there is some way to undo this knot that's been stuck there for 75, 80 years, it would be a remarkable thing. But yeah, there's a lot of hurdles you can see, almost immediately.
Yeah, and we're really watching those lines coming from President Trump as well, that Prime Minister Netanyahu, that President Trump has, quote, a different idea on Gaza that's worth exploring. So I guess they're still really trying to iron out what they could get out of these negotiations. But Mike, also, I was wondering, you were alluding to Gulf nations. How would this sit, even with these Arab nations having such a large U.S. presence trying to develop Gaza?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's sort of what President Trump's alluding to, is that perhaps they would do a lot of the financing of this, of the development of it, particularly if the US is having a stake in it or control of it, because that would imply US security there. But by the same token, I mean, what's sort of underlying a lot of all this too is the potential to get an Israeli-Saudi agreement, and that was, that seemed to be within reach just before October 7th, 2023 happened. One of the motivations for that among Hamas was to try to torpedo that agreement. And Saudi Arabia said pretty clearly it needs to be seeing progress toward a Palestinian state in order for this to go ahead. Now, this sort of changes sort of the goalpost, moves the goalpost completely here. So we'd have to just see what the Saudi reaction would be. But again, even though a lot of these countries aren't democracies, they do have to listen to the street, to their populations. And, the sympathy with the Palestinian plight is high. The amount of damage and suffering that was caused in Israel's campaign, the idea that then of them losing their homes on top of that, even if it is, and no doubt there would be, a nicer spot and more secure living and that sort of thing, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to reconcile. So it's going to take some pretty deft politics. As to Prime Minister Netanyahu, well, he's been around a long time, and he's already obviously dealt with President Trump once and quite successfully on behalf of Israel. So I guess that he's sort of tried to see, well, in amongst what the president's suggesting, what's realistic, what's not, and how can Israel potentially benefit out of it. So yeah, very, very interesting press conference, and we're just going to have to keep watching for more details, basically.
Yeah, Bloomberg News editor Michael Heath, and as Mike mentioned, this is the press conference that's still ongoing. Let's take a look, take a listen to see if we can sort of get some more details.
Any form of terror, the 28, if you call it, the 28 sites of terror, they had no money for any of it. They had to do their own and focus on their own well-being. And I hated to do it then, and I hate to do it just as much now. And I say this, and I say this to Iran, who's listening very intently. I would love to be able to make a great deal, a deal where you can get on with your lives and you'll do wonderfully. You'll do wonderfully. Incredible people, industrious, beautiful, just an unbelievable group of people in Iran. And I know them well, have many friends from Iran and many friends that are Americans from Iran, and they're very proud of Iran. But I hated to do it, just so you understand. And I hope we're going to be able to do something so that it doesn't end up in a very catastrophic situation. I don't want to see that happen. I really want to see peace, and I hope that we're able to do that. They cannot have a nuclear weapon. It's very simple. I'm not putting restrictions. They cannot have one thing. They cannot have a nuclear weapon. And if I think that they will have a nuclear weapon, despite what I just said, I think that's going to be very unfortunate for them. If, on the other hand, they can convince us that they won't, and I hope they can. It's very easy to do. It's actually very easy to do. I think they're going to have an unbelievable future. Yeah, please, sir, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. You just laid out your plan for Gaza.
Yes.
Can you lay out your plan for Ukraine and also
For Ukraine.
for Ukraine? Yes. You consider yourself a strong leader. You blamed your predecessor for letting Russia to take over Ukraine. Will you demand from Putin to get out of Ukraine, from sovereign territory of Ukraine?
So we're dealing right now in the subject. I don't want to spend a lot of time because we're here for another reason, but we are having very good talks, very constructive talks on Ukraine, and we are talking to the Russians. We're talking to the Ukrainian leadership. It would have never happened. That would have never happened. It should have never happened. I get reports every week. The number of soldiers, mostly soldiers now, the cities have been largely demolished. You talk about a very sad sight to see. We talk Gaza. Well, many of these cities look as bad as Gaza and worse, what's happened to them. And I want to see that end. And I want to see it end for one simple reason, the life of young people being absolutely obliterated on both sides. You probably have 700,000 Ukrainian soldiers dead, 800,000, maybe more Russian soldiers dead. It's very flat land, and the only thing that's going to stop a bullet is a human body, in this case, usually soldiers. And the numbers are staggering when you hear the real numbers in Ukraine, what the numbers are. And this doesn't include the cities that have been demolished and all of the people that were killed. So I want to see it stopped. We're having very good talks, and I think we're going to get it. I think something will be hopefully dramatically, it will rise above everything. You can't let this continue. This is an absolute slaughter that's taking place on the beautiful farmlands of Ukraine, and we have to stop it. We can't let this continue. It is a human tragedy, and we're going to try very hard to stop it. Yeah, please, go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Okay. Mr. President, what's your view about Palestinian leader Abbas' role in all the regional changes you want to do? And the question for the Prime Minister, what's your view on President Trump wanting to reach a deal with Iran and not a much more active military stance towards it?
Go ahead, baby. Go ahead.
I think the President just said something that I think is the pivot of everything that we're talking about. He said Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And we fully agree with that. If this goal can be achieved by a maximum pressure campaign, so be it. But I think the most important thing is to focus on the goal, which the President just did, and I fully agree with him.
Well, I said it, and he said it very well. It's a campaign of pressure to see if we can get something done. He doesn't want to do what some people think will automatically happen because they're very difficult people to deal with, as you know. But if we could solve this problem without warfare, without all of the things that you've been witnessing over the last number of years, it would be, I think it would be a tremendous thing. Go ahead, please.
Do you have any plans to visit Israel soon?
To visit where?
Israel and Gaza.
Oh, I love Israel. I will visit there, and I'll visit Gaza, and I'll visit Saudi Arabia, and I'll visit other places all over the Middle East. The Middle East is an incredible place, so vibrant, so it's just one of the really beautiful places, and with great people. And I think a lot of bad leadership has taken place in the Middle East that's allowed this to happen. It's just terrible. And that includes on the American side, by the way. We should have never gone in there a long time ago. spent trillions of dollars and created so much death. So that includes Americans. But yeah, I'll be visiting a lot of different places in the Middle East. I've been invited everywhere, but I will be visiting some, yeah. Okay. Let's go. Caitlin, go ahead.
All right, President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, they're continuing with that press conference saying that he will visit Israel, Gaza and Saudi Arabia, talking about the US taking over the Gaza Strip. We're seeing oil holding that drop as his trade wounds concerns really conflict against this maximum pressure campaign against Iran.
Markets never sleep, and neither does Interactive Brokers. Discover more opportunities with CME futures across equity.
In line with the previous number, the final January PMI composite 51.1, the PMI services 53, so a little bit of an improvement from the previous reading as we have the Japanese yen right now holding steady, a little bit of strength against the US dollar. We're still trying to digest all of the news around tariffs and of course all of the other currencies on the other side of the US dollar trade in focus right now. Take a look at how markets are moving at the moment as we continue to expect the China market reopen. Of course, that's happening today. Take a look right now at how currencies are trading because we are seeing the offshore yuan holding steady at that 728 level. We have seen that really fall to around record lows against the U.S. dollar given the tariff news coming from the U.S. But also at the same time, of course, we do have the more perhaps measured response that we saw from China yesterday as well. Joining us now from Hong Kong is Eddie Chung, Senior Emerging Market Strategist at Credit Agricole. Eddie, great to have you with us. So let's start with the big news today. I mean, Chinese mainland markets coming back online from the Lunar New Year holidays, and there's so much to digest on the tariff front, not to mention that they missed out all of the volatility around the Chinese startup DeepSeek. What are you expecting today?
Well, I think for the moment, if we're talking about FX, it's going to be still steady as she goes story. Basically, heading into the holidays, we saw there was some pressure on the CNY. The authorities were basically holding dollar CNY fixing very, very steady. Since then, as you mentioned, there's been a lot of volatility. Dollar CNH has been moving around back and forth. But our view is, in the context of this potential trade war between U.S. and China, in the context of the tariffs that are happening, it doesn't really make sense for China to introduce more FX volatility at this point in time. So in terms of dollar CNY fixing today, we are expecting a fairly steady fix. They've been holding this fixing below 720 for a while. We don't expect them to allow a very, very large move upward in dollar CNY spot at this time. There's really no sense in giving the U.S. more ammunition to hold against China right now. So it's going to be more steady as she goes for now.
When it comes to emerging market currencies, given, of course, the pressure on the weakness of the Chinese yuan that's always been perceived as an anchor for EM Asia, how are we expecting them to trade given also the other side of that trade, the strength of the U.S. dollar?
Well, I think it's been very clear. I think, firstly, the U.S. dollar remains in the driving seat. And as long as for dollar CNY we're not seeing unprecedented volatility, as long as we're not seeing massive volatility from that point of view, the impact on dollar Asia, in our view, is still fairly muted. Of course, in the context of the trade war or the tariff news that is happening right now, that does form a bit of a drag. In our view, the more cyclical currencies, the more trade-oriented currencies, the likes of the Korean won, Malaysian ringgit, Singapore dollar, these are the currencies which will be a lot more impacted. We have seen a bit more volatility in these currencies. But for now, as the dollar is softening a little bit since yesterday, it probably looks to be a bit more of a positive start. But after that, it will still be very, very driven by the trade headlines, how China responds, and of course, where we start with dollar CNY.
The main impact, of course, has been the primary targets of these tariffs, China, Canada, Mexico. But I do wonder, there's some optimism when it comes to how much China has diversified its trade flows. But what's the vulnerabilities if you take a look at some of the trading partners within Asia, Vietnam, for example, or even the likes of Korea?
I think there's two sets of vulnerabilities. So firstly, if we look at Trump and his policies, he is still very, very focused on the bilateral trade deficits between U.S. and the individual Asian economies. So for example, as you mentioned, Vietnam has a very, very large surplus. Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, these also have very, very large trade surpluses, and it has actually increased since his first term. So from that point of view, we do expect that to be a point of vulnerability, to also be a concern. If you look at the U.S. FX Treasury report that came out in November of last year, these also highlighted the large bilateral surpluses that these economies had with the U.S. So that will be the first thing. The second thing will be, well, in terms of the integration of the supply chains across Asia, clearly these trade-oriented economies, they also are very integrated in terms of the supply chains going through China, going to the US, and of course, vice versa. So if we see this rising trade friction coming through between US and China, then clearly for all these economies, it will also impact their trade flows. We saw this morning, you saw the Singapore PMI came out a bit lower. In terms of the Asian PMIs, actually it has been turning a bit more mixed. We believe that heading into the end of the year, there was a bit of front loading for exports and for manufacturing. And now that potentially softens off a bit, now that we are now entering January and February.
Your baseline when it comes to China tariffs was a great deal sort of more serious than what we've seen so far. Has that baseline shifted, or is there always that degree of uncertainty because there's so many different ways that this will play out? If he gets a deal, if there isn't a deal, if there's broader issues that might result in a more hawkish approach from the new administration.
Well, absolutely. I would definitely agree. There is a lot of uncertainty at this point in time. So our baseline is we're not in the most aggressive scenario of 60% tariffs. We're looking for somewhere in between around 40 or 30 to 40% or so. So clearly, Trump starting off with 10%, I would say is slightly positive. In terms of the China response yesterday, it was also very, very targeted. So I would say both sides are kind of positioning for there to be some sort of a negotiation. However, with regards to negotiating and whether there will be a successful negotiation, I think there are still a lot of issues which both sides will still need to work on. And probably that will mean that what we saw over the past 2 days is more of an opening salvo. It just allows the two sides to come to the table, talk a bit more, and potentially there will be more escalation further out. We're just at the beginning of Trump's term. Both sides are still feeling each other out. Of course, there are pressures from China's side as well. But there's also pressures both ways. If we do see a massive escalation of tariffs, our estimate is in terms of the GDP drag on U.S. growth, it can drag down U.S. growth by about 110 basis points over several years. It can push up inflation by 70 basis points. So that is also going to impact the U.S. And we must not forget that side of the picture. It's not just going to be about the China growth story. So given all these considerations, I think it makes sense for both sides to come to the table. But in terms of getting to a final agreement, we think probably that will need a bit more time. And that's also why we're probably in a bit more of an uncertain environment for now.
Eddie, always great to have you with us. Eddie Chung, Senior Emerging Market Strategist at Credit Agricole CIB, as we count down, of course, towards the reopening of mainland Chinese markets. The consumer outlook will be in focus, particularly just after Lunar New Year holidays. And we'll be speaking exclusively with the CEO of IMEX China a little bit later as well. At the times on your screen right now. Watching gold at the moment as we continue to see that haven demand, spot gold climbing to a fresh record high on that haven demand. And we've really seen this, of course, in the last few sessions when it comes to some of these fears over the trade war, the measures on Canada and Mexico and on China in particular. So another all-time high. The 10% tariffs on China and then the sort of retaliation or the countermeasures from Beijing seen as being more measured, but still we are seeing that supporting haven demand. Some of the weakness that we've seen in the dollar as well has also made gold more appealing for some of those foreign investors. But of course we have seen that effect playing out for precious metals levels even before those tariffs were announced. Gold alongside silver really surging above international benchmarks. We do have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Today's Asian Market Snapshot is presented by Interactive Brokers. Enter low-cost orders 24 hours a day on over 100 market centers in 24 countries and 22 currencies. Today's Asian Market Snapshot was presented by Interactive Brokers. Stocks, options, futures, forex, bonds. One world, one account.
Markets never sleep, and neither does Interactive Brokers. Discover more opportunities with CME futures across equity indices, interest rates, FX, energy, agriculture, and metals. CME futures offer around-the-clock access, deep liquidity, and capital-efficient margins, helping you seize opportunities whenever they happen. The best-informed investors choose Interactive Brokers.
In case you missed it, from Bloomberg's coverage at Davos.
Could it spell disaster if there's fear in the market?
Important trade-offs on the policy side, uncertainty and volatility in financial markets, but rates have gone up. We have $10 trillion in money market funds waiting to be deployed. So I think these things, create opportunities as well.
Nobody covers Davos like Bloomberg.
Take a look at how Asian tech names, especially semiconductors, are trading at the moment, because we are seeing that upside, especially for SK Hynix. That's seen a lot of volatility lately, especially with news of AI startup from China, DeepSeek. Tokyo Electron at the moment losing a little bit of ground as we follow, of course, the fallout from the latest earnings season from Alphabet as well. Alphabet contending with their own geopolitical issues as they were just targeted by Beijing for a probe into antitrust. Bloomberg Intelligence saying that the focus of China's investigation is likely on the market dominance of Google's Android mobile phone operating system in China's smartphone sector. Today, the market reaction, though, along with AMD on those disappointing fourth quarter results. Let's get more on those earnings with our tech reporter, Annabelle Drewler. Annabelle, so really Alphabet's cloud business had a pretty disappointing quarter.
Yeah, this is where investors are really focusing a lot of their attention. Disappointing, yes. I mean, it was just a little bit short of what analysts had been expecting in terms of the overall revenue, so we can take a look at that. But essentially, coming in at $11.96 billion, the estimate had been for around 12.2, so about a 2% drop. But of course, it's an area that Wall Street pays a lot of attention to, because given that there are other parts of Alphabet's business that are sort of more stable, this is really the big growth driver moving forward, and the extra attention coming down to it because of DeepSeek, of course, the Chinese AI startup that really pushed out this new model that has a model that is a small language model instead of a large language model that, of course, has been the mainstay of the likes of OpenAI to date. And so that big focus on would we need so much compute power moving forward, and were they starting